Want to call the roll?
For the May 14th meeting of the Charter Review Commission, Honorable Judge Adrian,
Here.
Diane Downing,
Here.
the Honorable Susan Drucker,
Here.
Dennis Kennedy,
Here.
Mayor Persiak,
Here.
Claire Rosacco. Here. Victor Ruiz. Michael? Is Davida on the call?
She
Okay.
was.
Maybe she'll have to call back in. We have a quorum.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so the first order of business today is to take up the proposal on campaign finance that's been put forward by Mr. Tarter. He's present on today's date, and I want to give him the opportunity. He and I have had some conversation in the interim period of time about some proposed modifications to his original proposal, and he's going to speak on those today.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon.
And commission members, our elected officials and guests. Thanks so much for having me back. William Tarter from Broadview Heights. And I wanted to first say Happy Mother's Day to all those present, and hope everyone had a good weekend. I wanted to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your feedback and all of the commission members for their suggestions in my last presentation. I also was able to meet with several elected officials since my last presentation, and my goal today, I know we have a hard stop at 5, so I'm gonna be brief and hopefully be able to give you the current update that would be satisfactory to the commission. So, without further ado, we'll head into the presentation. As a reminder, I am appearing as a private citizen and not representative of any employer or civic organization. I am thankful for the support of the Cleveland chapter of the NAACP, as well as the League of Women Voters, among other elected officials as well. So as I stated when I was before the commission 6 weeks ago, this issue is complicated and multifaceted. And one of the things that I discovered during the last presentation is that there are a number of vantage points on this issue, which I knew going in, but the devil is always in the details. And so that's one of the things that for me was to figure out what can be done in a timely manner that would ultimately be beneficial to the citizens of the county and to this commission. And that provides the framework for my presentation today. One of the things that came up in the last presentation, especially from some of the public officials, was what things we can do and what things we cannot do. And one of the things that was mentioned in the past presentation was that the Supreme Court made their ruling and we have to abide by that, and I completely agree. And that's one of the things that I wanted to make note, is that I do understand and recognize the legal framework that we find ourselves in on this issue. So what are the things that we can address, and what are the things that we will just have to continue to advocate at the federal level? And one of the things that we can do is we can talk about campaign finance filings that can be done electronically. We can talk about contractor disclosures. We did talk briefly around contractor limits the last time I was here. And then one of the things that I wanted to do was to put the county in a position that if we wanted to address campaign finance limits in the future, we'd have the ability to do that. So think of this presentation as incremental progress as opposed to going to a one fell swoop solution. Now, before I go to the next page, I do want to make mention on the ability to electronically file a campaign finance filing. Right now, counties are prohibited from having electronic filing. You have to have a paper-only campaign finance filing. And there is current legislation, Senate Bill 44, that is pending before the Ohio General Assembly that would seek to change that and would allow counties to file electronic campaign finance filings at the county level. And that would, I believe, go a long way to meeting one of the concerns that was raised at the last meeting about the inability to search filings from year to year or to sort filings by donation amount. So I'm thankful that this is being taken up at the state level and look forward to following the progress of that legislation for the rest of this year. Moving to the next page, as I said during the last presentation, I was able to get a lot of feedback from elected officials, and I'm thankful to say that even since the last presentation before that, I was able to get additional feedback from council members as well as other elected officials in terms of what they would feel reasonable is something to look forward to in the future. So thinking of this as a phased approach and instead of, again, going for the one fell swoop. And so I'd like to provide a little bit of feedback on what those conversations were like. There seemed to be some openness to conversations around campaign finance limits, but there was similar trepidation as what was heard in the last presentation about the influence of dark money and how campaign finance limits, if enacted, there was concern on how would that hamper the ability or inability to raise against that dark money. At the same time, there was an openness to bring the county into alignment in some form with the other levels of government, which was something that even some of the elected officials were surprised to know about some of the things that I shared with this last commission about our rates being the highest in the country at the state level, and in some instances, in many instances at the county, there's no limits at all. One of the things that I wanted to cite, though, in the city examples of my research, there is language in the charter that enables campaign related items, whether it's campaign finance limits or disclosures or whatever. But the specifics of those are laid out in ordinance as opposed to in the actual charter. And also the threshold for passage is different as opposed to a supermajority for a charter change, majority in terms of the enactment of an ordinance. And so I really want to put a pin in that throughout the duration of this presentation. I'd like to take you back to one of the pages in my last presentation. The question was posed by Mayor Persiak on if the county has the ability to create campaign finance limits. And I put in my slide the answer to that question is yes. And I highlighted at the time that unless there's a municipal or county charter that provides otherwise, and I'd like to underline that that phrase, that provides otherwise. So the key here is for the charter to be able to provide the ability to have limits that are enacted in ordinance. On to the next page. So one of the things I'd like to do is to propose language that would be inserted into the charter. And right now there is no current language, as has been clearly laid out. Section 3.09 does add the words and duties there to council, but specifically adds a subsection to establish by ordinance campaign-related laws governing the election of any county officers and officials, including without limitation campaign finance limits, donor disclosure requirements, donor age limits, enforcement, or other provisions to avoid violations of the public trust. So this language, to avoid violations of the public trust, is mirrored on other sections of the charter. And then there are also issues in there that should the county choose to examine the topic of campaign finance limits or disclosure requirements, the county would be enabled to do that. Yes.
So this will be a new section 13 to section, or subsection 13 to section 3.09?
That is correct. Yes, Your Honor. All right, on to the next page. In addition to the actual language that would be proposed by this body, in the last Charter Review Commission, we included in each recommendation, each language recommendation, a small introductory paragraph that explained the rationale for why the Charter Review Commission came to the decision that it did. In this case, I would like to request that this commission note the absence of campaign finance related language in the government and the need to bring the county into alignment with other levels of government. How and when the county chooses to do that is up to the elected officials at the time that they choose to do that. However, just noting the fact that there are no limits and that this is something that the county can be equipped to change in the future moving forward. And if the Supreme Court, if there's a ruling or something like that, the county will be in position to handle those changes as well. If this proposal is passed by council to a vote of the people, then it would be preferable, in my opinion, to ask council leadership for the legislative process to remedy the absence of campaign-related language right away, perhaps under the review of one of the committees, which case it's council operations, intergovernment relations, and public transportation. So we would have advocates work with elected officials to come up with some ordinance language that could be considered at the time. But in order for that process to even begin, the charter would have to have language inserted to allow for this process to begin. And that's the next step if there was to be a first step of getting this language inserted in the charter in the first place.
So again, interrupt you for a second.
Yes.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that at the time that we moved this language to council, adopted this language, chose to place this language on the ballot, that council at the same time that they were placing this on the ballot, would be developing language to implement it?
Not necessarily. What I would be hopeful is that if the council were to put this on the ballot, some of the advocates made a report a few years ago on recommendations that could be considered. And one of the things that I think is an opportunity for improvement is the lack of sample language that could be submitted as a resolution to consider. So let's say that this got passed by the voters in November of that year, then you'd have a whole new county council in the next term, and they can decide, how they want to do this, or when they want to do it, or even if they want to do it. But for advocates to have something ready to share with them and say, here's some of the things that we would like to see, and then the council can work with advocates to figure out, what they're open to or how you do enforcement. The point of that is not necessarily commanding council to do anything. What it is saying is that if you were to have any language that is done by ordinance, it would require time to work out some of the details on enforcement and exact language. And you would not have the ability to do that in just a few weeks or just a few months. This could take could take years. But the point is to work with council as they develop that ordinance in order to put something on the books that would be helpful. So no, it's not saying it would happen at the exact same time. What it's saying that if the voters approved, that advocates could have some sample language ready to give to council to consider once they're sworn in January.
And you just have to bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that I'm clear. So the initial proposal is to provide council with the ability
Correct.
to draft language that would deal with campaign finance.
Mm-hmm.
And if council thought that that was appropriate direction that should be taken up, they would then put it on this November's ballot for the people to pass.
Yep, at some point, anytime in the future.
And then if the vote by the public favored this, then again, subsequent to that vote, that this legislative process would begin, or are you saying that legislative process would begin before?
What I'm saying is that, let's say the vote happens in November. The council gets sworn in January. That there could be legislation that advocates can give to council and say, here's some draft text for you to review and to consider. As opposed to getting 11 different opinions, it would say, here are some ideas, here's some draft legislation, and then what things are you open to, what things aren't you open to. So that process could begin the following year, but it's not to say that you can't have something ready to submit to council at some point between now and then. So no, it's not subverting any part of council and their ability to do something. It's just saying that hopefully if this commission approves and council approves and the voters ultimately approve, then advocates can have something ready-made to submit to council to deliberate in the following term.
So theoretically, people could be working on that sample language now.
Absolutely.
And at the point that this was passed, they could be prepared to present it to council the after.
If they wanted to, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I mean, do you think that the voters would pretty much give a carte blanche permission to the council to enact this type of thing? Wouldn't they want to see definitive language as to what they're voting on? I mean,
So to make sure I understand you correctly, in the case of ordinance versus charter change, when would the public have the ability to have input on what ultimately gets passed? Is that what you're saying?
now what I'm worried about is the language that would appear on the ballot, which would authorize the council to pretty much enact or discipline themselves, and I wonder if the public would go along with that.
So
Am I missing something here, Judge?
I guess my response to that would be, and just make sure that I understand what you're saying. My response would be if it's done by charter to give council or really any elected official the ability to enact language, that's something that the voters would have the say right now in order for council to be able to do that.
But that's
then,
what you want to do, correct?
correct. But then I also want the public to be equally engaged after that process is done when the ordinance is being considered. So if this is something that the public can have input and say, here is what I think about some of the things you guys are being discussed. I mean, that happens now. The council, will put something out there and then voters have the ability to have input on it. And then if it gets passed or not, and not necessarily have the public vote on a charter change. So public engagement would be critical to both of these processes. The ability for the charter change to happen to give the county the ability to do that, as well as the ordinance process on what things they agree with. Maybe there's some things they disagree with, or any suggestions. So I think public engagement on this is going to be critical. I think your question is more rooted in the comfort level of people having the ability to, for elected officials to have input over something that affects themselves.
Well, I would use the word discipline.
Discipline. That is a concern whether or not this proposal moves forward or not. So the ability or inability for elected officials to have input on something that affects them is going to be present whether you have specific language to propose to this commission or not. That doesn't change. So the question is, what is council okay with that could get to the ballot? And then after that decision is made, what can council work with advocates and members of the general public to put
I
into
follow
law?
you. I think this, Mr. Chairman, I think Susan Drucker was trying to say something. Am I right?
Somebody was.
Oh. Sorry, Mayor.
Someone.
No, I was I'm still listening. I haven't spoken.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Were you trying to get in?
Yes, I was just asking if you could talk a little more into your mic.
Uh-oh.
It's kind of hard to hear some of the questions. I could hear Will, but I can't hear some of the questions that were being raised.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, to your point, Mayor, I think when you have a specific language that's being put forward by the charter, sometimes when you have language that comes out of this commission, there may be things that, legally can't be done, so council will vote it down and then do something
I'll
else.
just give you an example what I've lived through, and we're trying to, we're
Yeah.
having a charter review commission in the city of Strongsville going on right now. And 5 years ago, we put on the ballot so that if we have 5 of the 7 council members present, that we could pass legislation enabling the 5 of the 7 to accept emergency legislation to pay bills without a bid. We couldn't get that passed, and that language was very specific on the ballot. The people would not go along with it. And it's gonna go back out there again. And it was very definitive, and we couldn't get it passed because they felt we had to have unanimous decision. Going out there with, and I know what you're trying to say, we gotta get the county council to at least put this on the ballot. And so, and then give them some room to define the parameters. I'm not sure the voters will go along with that, that's all I'll say.
Do you mind me asking, in Strongsville,
Past experience.
does the Charter Review Commission make recommendations?
Do the count, just like we're doing here. And
So-
then they have to put it on the ballot.
Is
yes.
council mandated to put recommendations from the Charter Review Commission on the ballot?
No,
In Broadview Heights, we are,
yeah, not in Strongsville.
and not in Strongsville.
And what's the,
Oh, the council is not mandated. They're mandated to vote on our recommendations.
yes, that's just like with us.
Right, so that,
Strongsville, I'm sorry.
right, so
Clearly
I think
identify.
that, I think, that poses the issue here in terms of specificity and what council is okay with, in addition to what the voters will be okay with. So I think that's the balancing act that I find here, that the last time I was too specific, and that left it open to deliberation and frankly, rejection, because things were so specific. And therefore, if you keep it vague, in this case, you can say, all right, let's have time between the first reading and the second reading that we can deliberate and we can make suggestions that would strengthen the proposal, as opposed to doing something that's too strict.
I understand
And
what you're
then-
trying to
and
do,
then
I'm
you
just
run into
questioning
problems
whether
later.
it's gonna happen. You should add something on this, because I'm sure this is your belly.
So, I mean, Will, I think what you're getting at is the fact that in order to get this on the ballot, you need a supermajority of council. You need 8 votes to get it on the ballot. So if there are 8 votes on council to put this on the ballot, you've at least got buy-in and some type of consensus in concept. And then, if there is something to be put in ordinance, then that would only require a vote of 6, and it wouldn't require approval of the voters. So, if the devil's in the details, maybe that can be worked out in a more sort of the normal legislative process. I mean, that seems to be the approach, if I understand it, that
Yep,
you're going for
exactly
here.
correct.
But I understand, Mayor, your point in that, the vaguer you leave it in terms of the charter language itself, the more skeptical you might have from the electorate. So.
And the media.
Yeah, but I can see both sides of this argument.
Judge, but we live in the real world.
I know, and it's hard to what is it, somebody said it's really hard to make predictions, especially when it's about the future. Okay. It's hard to know what the electorate would do. But what I see as a possibility is that if this language does go on and calling for, campaign finance reform, in essence, and council passes it in its vague form and puts it out to the public, and if the public passes it, particularly if the public passes it overwhelmingly, then I think that gives some impetus to council to come back and revisit it and do something with it. Now, of course, if it comes back and it's namby-pamby, or if it goes down to defeat, then what it kind of suggests is that the public's not there yet, and maybe this is just something that, whose time has not come. But at least if the council puts its imprimatur on it by saying, yeah, we believe that campaign finance is something that we ought to take up, and they give it to the public, and the public says, yeah, we think that you should be doing it too, you know, that may be a good thing. Whether it would happen or not
That's
is
the
another
question.
thing. Okay, but there's only one way to find out, and that's kind of to try it.
Bingo. And we don't want to shut it down before we ask the voters.
No, I'm not, I'm just bringing up both sides of it.
No, that's all right. If it's all right with you, Mayor, can I just
Oh,
round
please,
out
please,
the presentation and then we can.
I'm sorry, we didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's all right. That's all right. I just know we're pressed for time and I want to make sure that I get to the other parts of it. So if I can just advance to the next slide. All right. So in terms of the benefits of this new proposal. So this is a relatively new government, and we have issues of public trust from the very beginning, and even to present day, we continue to try and build up trust in this government. And I think that this would provide an avenue for the public to have input, as well as the legislators to have input on things that would seek to strengthen the public trust. People that I talk to are usually surprised to know that there is no campaign-related language in the charter at all, and find that surprising. And so that's something that, for me, this could be used as an avenue to pass legislation, whether by charter or by ordinance, that would seek to increase that public trust. In addition, this again enables the county the ability to do things moving forward, regardless of what that looks like. You would also future-proof the charter, so if there was a Supreme Court case change or something like that, or if there were things that are admissible, like the federal contractors ban that we've talked about earlier, all that would be permissible due to this language. And then allows for the public to, our conversation we just had, to make an initial statement on the ability for the county to enact such language, and then hopefully have some sort of continued conversation afterwards. So finally, I just believe that one of the things that we want to do in this county is to talk about what we can do and what we can't do, and hopefully we can have a process that is open and transparent and allows for the county to bring itself into alignment with other levels of government, and then also leave itself the ability to have an engagement process on what those language or disclosures. It doesn't have to be campaign finance limits. Let me be very clear about this. It doesn't necessarily have to be limits. It could just be disclosures. It could be electronic filing, that we just talked about. We can talk about this during the actual process, as opposed to narrowing it down to this limit, which I'm open to this limit, but not to this limit, and this is where I think it should start, and trying to decide that in a matter of weeks. Let's have the process where the public is able to have input, public officials are able to have input, then hopefully we can come up with something at the end that we have public buy-in. And hopefully before the next Charter Review Commission in the next 10 years.
10 years away.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah.
So thank you for the opportunity to present this retooled proposal, and I do hope that this finds favor with this commission.
So let me ask you a couple more questions, and so one of the things that we were talking about is specificity versus lack of specificity.
Yes, sir.
And you mentioned a couple of other things that were not specifically campaign limit, related, but also might be something that because it does not speak to campaign limits, might be something that could be added into this proposal to give it some specificity. So had you thought about that as a possibility?
I have, Your Honor. And in the last presentation, I was grateful to hear both the county executive and 2 members of county council, both with very different opinions on my initial proposal of 7,500. One was not open to any limits at all, and the other council member thought that the number was too high. And so one of the things that I was trying to be respectful of and frankly cognizant of is that if you move in too far a direction, you risk losing buy-in at all. And so if you have council members, let's say that you had some council members who are open to having the state limits match the county limits. So the county council districts basically match the state house districts in Cuyahoga County, or they're very, very close. So let's say that you were to put language in ordinance that would match what.
Feedback loop.
Oh boy, is that how I sound? And I hate myself on video. So anyway, when you have people who would be open to state limits, and maybe that's the easy fix, because it's like, okay, whatever the state limits are, it's what the county limits would be, and that's what we're comfortable with. That can be enacted by ordinance, and that's it. Or it could be something along the lines of disclosure, or it could be age limits. So right now, the state of Ohio, the minimum age contribution is age 7. 7 years old. Makes no sense. So let's say the county said, okay, that's a little bit low. We want to have an age requirement of 18. Okay, we can talk about that during that process. Does it have to do with limits per se? No. Is it something that could seek to increase the public trust? Absolutely. So these are the types of things we can talk about during the legislative process that hopefully voters will give us the opportunity to deliberate those things and then hopefully come up with some sort of outcome.
Okay.
Question?
Yes.
Judge?
Yes.
Is this, a couple of questions, is this legislation that would be the outcome of the charter, is it only applicable to the county executive and the county council members?
No, it would be any public official in the county.
So the prosecutor and
executive.
judges on top of the state restrictions, if those were different?
No, I believe the judges are mandated by the Ohio Supreme Court. So in this case, it would be county executive, county prosecutor, county council.
And it would only be related to individual annual amounts?
So this was the conversation that came up the last time around in terms of do you do it by calendar year or by election cycle? And I would prefer to have that type of detailed question during the ordinance process, as opposed to making that a part of this proposal.
And then, Will, how about, and I'm not expecting you to know all the answers to the questions, but in terms of administering this and having like a penalty section, how would that, I mean, who's gonna monitor this, or does that just fall under the requisite authority of an existing?
In this case, the devil will be in the details during the ordinance process. So whether that's, you have a board of ethics or, inspector general, I mean, these are conversations that could be had during the deliberation process as opposed to the specifics of this proposal.
And
Who
there's,
usually monitors these things?
So there's, the
I don't
board
know.
does have input on it, but there are different ways of enforcement. So like the inspector general right now has the list of county contractors and the part of registration for contractors. So you could tie some of the things that we talk about, contractors, into some of the trainings there. I mean, there's multiple ways to deliberate in terms of enforcement, penalties, disclosures, and when those disclosures are made. So I mean, all of this would be a part of the legislative process, as opposed to enacting those level of details in the county charter.
this one, could I ask one more, Judge? This, I understand putting in the context of the legislative discussion, but you know, sometimes things don't go 3 readings and sometimes things get passed under emergency. So would there not be a fear that basing everything on some public discussion that's over some extended time, that'd be a huge leap? I mean, there would be some risk to that. I'm not saying our council does that, but, you know, over the years, everybody's been part of a income tax measure that gets passed at 7 in the morning on a weekend, and I just think we would be kind of putting a lot of trust in the process associated with the amendment that I think would raise the mayor's concerns even higher.
Sure. Well, I think that the question of whether something is passed under second reading suspension or passed as an emergency is a much broader issue in terms of when and how often city or county councils pass legislation under second reading suspension versus 3 readings. So I would not try and use that as a deterrent to why this should not happen, as opposed to saying that it could happen. Right now, the fact that we don't have anything is the issue. And how we would get to that is something that I hope that our elected officials would see the value in having multiple readings or having a process that some of the details that you just asked could be worked out, as opposed to arbitrarily putting something together and passing it under second reading suspension and then just getting it passed by the council.
Okay, thank you.
So again, if I'm understanding the real gist of your proposal, it really is to give council specific authority to take up the broad area of campaign finance writ large and all of its myriad things. Not necessarily that they would do it all at once. They could do it piecemeal.
Absolutely.
They could do it as they saw it, a need. They could choose not to do it at all, but they would have the authority if, in fact, this was passed by the public.
Yes, sir.
And your point is that right now, there's no imperative for council to do anything with regard to campaign finance because there's nothing in the document that suggests that it's really in their bailiwick.
Correct.
Okay, so this would put it in their bailiwick
Correct.
if the public
If the public approves.
agrees.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
Put it to the vote of the people.
Put it to the vote of the people. Let's see where their heads are at.
Absolutely.
Okay. Anything, Mike?
No, Mr. Chair, I just one thought, and I know this was a point of discussion earlier, and I don't think it's disqualifying for this amendment. I just want to call attention to the fact that it appears, Will, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the text of your actual amendment on the 6th slide here is substantially similar to what was recommended by the last Charter Review Commission. I think you added a couple items on the non-exhaustive list that's in part 13 there.
Yes,
So
that is correct.
I just want to make sure that was your intent.
No, absolutely. In fact, that was my intent. The last time it was a topic that was considered among 25 other topics, that we did not have the level of conversation, research, discourse that we have had in this commission. And I believe that council did their due diligence in asking what need does this address? What problem does this solve? And that provided a very clear picture into the approach that the council members take to this issue. And that allowed me to, I hope, refine my proposal in such a way that it says that this is something that does address an issue. It allows for the county to tackle this at some point in the future. It does not mandate, because last time we put powers and duties and basically told council do something, and did not address the issue that it would be solving. And that is something that in this proposal, I believe that it does give the county the ability to do something, and it is a solution to an issue that we've more clearly identified this time around.
Okay.
I hope that council agrees.
Susan, anything?
No, nothing to add at this time, Judge. Thanks.
Davida?
No, Judge, I just want to commend Will on his efforts with the campaign financing and actually pulling back some of the demands from his proposals from the last Charter Review Commission. Great presentation from last time to this time. Job done.
Thank you, Davida.
Okay. Is Diane on?
Hi, everyone. This is Victor, and I apologize for being really late.
Victor, did you have any questions you wanted to pose to Will?
No, thank you.
You're all clear? Okay. Is Diane on?
Yes, I am.
Any-
I don't have any questions at this time. Thank you, Judge.
Okay. All righty. That's it, right? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the commission.
Have any other discussion amongst the members of the commission before we open this up to public input?
None for me.
Okay. Okay. All right. We're open for public discussion.
We have public comment from Marsha Goldberg.
Do you want me to come up there? or
Yes.
just stand?
Wherever you're comfortable.
My mic is working. Well, we're coming off the success.
Are we on?
Yes. I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters in Greater Cleveland, coming off our big win for Issue 1, which we're really excited about. But I wanted to just say that I understand why Will pulled back a little, and we are totally supportive of this draft of the charter amendment. The league really is struggling to get money out of politics in any way it can. My worry is only that council will sit on this and do nothing. So we need, and the league is ready, number one, to publicly support this amendment, to push it to, among our members and our non-members through various media that we can reach out to. And also to urge council to do something if this passes. And I was particularly interested in the fact that once it is okayed by council and it's okayed by the voters, that we wouldn't need 8 votes to get something passed in council. So I just want to say how much the league does support this proposed amendment. Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll now have public comment from Lou.
At first, I thought the modification will be still towards the dollar amount. But right now, I have to say I'm so happy to hear that we have other things also related to campaign finance, like the age limit. Now, think about the 7-year-old to donate money to. Now, I doubt how many of us, including the current 7-year-olds, we still have a problem to choose between our vegetables and dessert. And that actually is the problem. So you don't have a proper nutrition, and that means people may contribute money to the people who may not really do majority people's good.
Who offer dessert?
Yes, you like dessert for this moment, but later you will find out you have to go to see doctors more often. So if we don't really vote for candidates, with enough information and knowledge, and we just keep donating to people, we may think, oh, he's fine or she's pretty, that type of situation, that's really no good. So I think right now this new proposal really widened the aspects of the whole situation. It's not only the dollar amount, it's we should have the people who make a good judgment to donate the money to the candidates they want to support. I think that's even more important. A very good thing for our democracy and for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you. We done? Okay. Motion? It's been moved, second? Second. Probably moved and seconded that we stand in adjournment. We will so stand. Thank you. Now, yeah, two things.
Oh, we know he's still around. We know he is still around.
This is called perfect timing. We just moved to adjourn.
I thought you were talking about succession now.
No.
No, that's why we know you're around. No problem.
But actually, that was one of the things that I wanted to do and probably should have done before I moved to adjourn. The next meeting that we have scheduled is this Wednesday, and we'll take up the issue of the Inspector General. We still have to go back, circle back around to the issue of succession. There have been a couple of drafts that have been circulated, since the last meeting because we had so much, kind of information that was percolating up that Michael and I kind of got our heads together and thought about, some of the things that we've been told by the various people who had testified here. And between the two of us, I asked him to take a shot at putting something together, and then I made a couple of suggestions, and then we sent it out to Dennis as the vice chair. And then after we had kind of manipulated a little bit, we sent it out to everybody else, and I hope that folks will have enough time so that the next time that we come together, we have, a good idea as to direction. And so that's something that's coming up, but not the next time. Next time is for Inspector General, and I think at the time we get to there, we need to pick a time when we can come back around to succession. Okay? So I will see you on Wednesday.